Caldera-Durant, and I am Vice President at Fund the People, and I'd like to welcome you to our fourth webinar in our Talent Justice series, Investing in Equitable Ascension into Nonprofit Leadership. So I'd like to say good morning to our friends on the West Coast and good afternoon to our friends in the Midwest and East Coast. So we're pleased to have you join us today, and if this is the first time you're joining us, welcome. And for those of you who are returning to join us for today's webinar, thank you for participating in our previous webinars that covered our research findings for the Talent Justice Initiative, access to nonprofit careers, and advancement within the nonprofit workforce. Today's webinar will be recorded, and we will share the recording and the PowerPoint slides shortly after the webinar. Before we begin the webinar, I'd like to acknowledge that this meeting is being held in part in Milford, Connecticut, which is Aboriginal land, the land of the Wepawag tribe and the larger Paugussett tribe. I'd like to pay respect to their elders, past and present. So today we continue our exploration of the talent justice research. And the research has been done in partnership with the Center for Urban and Racial Equity. And the research that we did as partners explored the challenges and opportunities and promising practices of investing in intersectional racial equity in the nonprofit workforce. You can access the Talent Justice Research and Toolkit by going to talentjustice.org. Today we have over 110 people registered for the webinar. So due to the size of the audience, we've muted everyone's audio and disabled your video. Also, for those of you who are into live tweeting, we encourage you to use the hashtag TalentJustice to do so. At first, we will hear about Fund the People, learn more about what our work is, and also the Talent Justice Ascension research findings. Q&A to answer any questions about that information. Then we'll turn to our case study with LeaderSpring. Then we'll have a brief, actually a longer Q&A. Then we'll share resources, upcoming events, and then we'll wrap up. First up is my colleague, Rusty Stahl. He is founder and president and CEO of Fund the People, where he stewards our vision and mobilizes resources for our mission. He previously served as founding executive director of Emerging Practitioners in Philanthropy, otherwise known as EPIP, the National Association of Young and New Foundation Professionals. I'm also excited to introduce you to Dr. Sonja Bathsheba Mañjon. Sonia is the executive director of LeaderSpring Center, a 21-year-old leadership development organization whose mission is to foster a powerful, equity-driven social sector by strengthening leaders and organizations, developing communities of leaders, and transforming the systems in which they work. Sonia is a LeaderSpring alumna, class of 2006, who returned to the Bay Area from Columbus, Ohio, to become their second executive director. Sonia has more than 25 years of experience in higher education, nonprofit, and government administration. She earned a PhD in humanities, specializing in transformative learning and change in human systems, and a master's in cultural anthropology and social transformation from the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco. Sonia received a Bachelor of Arts in World Arts and Cultures with an emphasis in dance from the University of California, Los Angeles. Sonia lives in the San Francisco Bay Area with her sons, Zion and Ezra, and Sonia is also a member of Fund the People's National Advisory Council. So we're really excited to have Sonia and Rusty here today to discuss this important topic.
I'm thrilled about this conversation. And the topic today is equity in ascension to nonprofit leadership. We're really talking about, in this case, executive positions. At Fund the People, we don't equate leadership with executive directors all the time. We think that that is a very narrow view of leadership, and that the entire nonprofit workforce counts and is critical. And every team member, from incoming interns to outgoing executive directors, are crucial to performance, impact, and sustainability. And so the previous webinars in this series have covered kind of an overview of our research on talent justice, and then we did one on access to careers and jobs in the nonprofit workforce, so really looking at entry-level and apprenticeship opportunities. Then we had one on advancement, mid-career retention, and moving up and around in the field. And this one is really looking at executive roles in the sector. And oftentimes this is framed as executive transition and focuses on the outgoing executives. We wanted to also think about incoming executives and the dynamics with incoming and outgoing. How do people make it to this point? And what are their experiences in terms of their identities and their jobs in ascending to executive director roles? We also will explore the role of funders and consultants in that process. So that's a little bit of framing around the topic. So just a brief thing about Fund the People. We are the national campaign to maximize investment in the nonprofit workforce. We were started in 2014 to try to influence and inform both funders and nonprofits around attitudes and practices in terms of how we think about and treat nonprofit workers. Our premise is that the nonprofit workforce is the most essential variable, if you will, in terms of nonprofit effectiveness, and that we ought to put people at the center of how we plan, how we budget, how we fundraise, how we fund organizations. That if we have great strategies, but we don't support our staff and we have lots of burnout, et cetera, we will not be able to implement those wonderful dreams. So that's a little background. You can find more about Fund the People at fundthepeople.org. And happy to, in the Q&A, answer any questions about the organization. We see the problem in the field as being a chronic deficit of investment in the nonprofit workforce. You know, a lot of conversations in our field have been about the lack of leadership in the field, or leaders ready to step up. We don't think there's any lack of people, professionals, leaders. We think it's a lack of investment. So the main analogy we use is that the nonprofit workforce is not a pipeline, but on a journey, on this pathway, this career or leadership pathway. And the problem is, due to this lack of investment, there's a bottleneck on this highway. And this bottleneck acts as kind of a filter, if you will, a kind of that keeps people from moving in and through. And so at the access point, there are a lot of people, I think, in our society who would love to join our workforce if they knew it was a possibility to do work in the nonprofit sector and be paid for it. But because of unpaid internships, poor compensation, and other factors, access really starts to narrow tremendously. And then in advancement, the levels of burnout and churn in our sector, the lack of support, and frankly, the flat nature of many organizations, the lack of places to go, and the lack of investment in professional development often leads people to go elsewhere. And finally, it gets even narrower at the ascension point. And so there's a lot of talk in the sector about how do we get more diverse executives in the C-suite and on boards. And the fact is, if you have this filter going on, the problem doesn't begin and the solution doesn't begin at the point of ascension. It really has to look all the way back at advancement and access if we want to build a more equitable sector in terms of the entire workforce. So in terms of talent justice, I want to give you two definitions. So since 2014, we've been developing a framework we call talent investing, which is meant to be a really practical alternative to the starvation cycle and the overhead myth. So talent investing is the intentional deployment of resources to support and develop professionals and leaders in the nonprofit workforce. You can read more about this in our toolkit and on our website. This year, we launched the Talent Justice Initiative, and we define talent justice as investments in nonprofit staff that advance intersectional racial equity across the nonprofit career life cycle. So I've just talked about what we mean by across the nonprofit career life cycle in the previous slides. In terms of intersectional racial equity, we are not the only ones talking about this. We're not the most expert by a long stretch. But we love this phrase intersectional racial equity, which Borealis Philanthropy was using. So we borrowed it because it leads with race, puts race as essential to equity, but also acknowledges issues of gender, sexuality, religion, geography, generation, ability, other factors that class, all of which are in the mix in terms of equity and interacting along the way. So this was our effort to infuse an equity lens into the talent investing concept. So Talent Justice Initiative itself put out this study. We're going to talk about some of the data points. There are tools, infographics, and webinars like this. They're all up at talentjustice.org. And these are some of the foundations and corporations that have supported this work. So I'm going to share 3 slides which feature some of the data from our research. Again, you can find an executive summary and a full report on talentjustice.org. We're not going to cover too much today. It's really going to be a conversation featuring Sonia and her work as a way to bring to life these issues from LeaderSpring's experience. But we will hit some highlights here from the research. So in this figure from the report, figure 25, we examined what are the barriers to ascension in the field. And we broke this one out by white and people of color. So the green are white respondents. This is a survey of over 1,400 folks in the field that we did last summer. And then the sort of brown is people of color. And so just to hit, what this shows is that there's some alignment. There's also some differences in perspective. The second one on the left, I feel pressure to not make mistakes. Clearly, there was a big difference between white and people of color reactions to that. And I think that becomes important as we start to talk about this issue of people feeling set up for success or failure by their boards, their funders, and others. A critical one is that first red circle on the right. Funders use a wait and see approach. Again, more people of color seem to experience that as a barrier. What that means, and we're going to talk about it more today, is that funders wait to renew support or find new ways to support new executive directors until the funder feels that the person has shown that they will succeed. So where our assumption going into this research was that is a harmful experience that puts a lot of risk on the ED and the nonprofit, and not a lot of risk on the funder side. Unable to see myself in a leadership role. Again, big distinction here between whites and people of color. And former leadership failed to fully depart. This is something I think I see, at least informally, going on a lot in the field. Moving to the next slide. So this is a statistically significant finding from that data. Again, digging into that wait and see approach. The researchers broke this out by immigration experience in the respondents and found that people born outside of the United States had a statistically significant greater experience of the wait and see approach and bias and discrimination in hiring and performance evaluation. And people who were born in the US but have at least one parent who was an immigrant or is an immigrant also had more of those experiences than folks who identified as being born in the US without a recent immigrant experience in their family. So this was something we didn't know going in. We didn't expect this. And I think particularly in this heated environment around immigration in our society and in our policy environment, this is a real critical issue for organizations to be aware of. Finally here, figure 29, I want to highlight a couple. This is looking at the needs, the level of need that all respondents suggested these variables met in terms of equity in Ascension. And then so the red is the need, the brown or orange is what funders self-reported as their foundations investing in these issues. And then the green is what nonprofit folks said their organizations were investing in. So, for example, in the environment in an organization enabling risk and learning, you can see that 23% of respondents thought this was a need. 45% of nonprofit folks said they were investing in this, but only 15% of funders said they were. And again, this goes to this question of risk and learning, sort of a runway for new executive directors to get their feet on the ground and establish themselves in the role. Work-life balance efforts promote wellness. Again, you can see the level of need, 16% funders are under that by 2 notches, and nonprofits are way up at 35%, which is interesting because in my experience, a lot of nonprofits are not investing in their own wellness. But so that was interesting. And handoff of funding relationships, a critical issue for incoming executive directors and outgoing executive directors, both of whom want to see stability in their organizations. Again, funders below the level of need, above, in this case, above the need by 4 points, and nonprofits much higher. But this I thought was another interesting and important challenge to highlight. There's a lot more even in just these slides, and then there's a lot more data in the reports.
Just curious to hear from all of you in the chat box, if you could please answer this question. If you could let us know what has helped you to advance in your leadership. Were you mentored? Were you coached? Did you participate in a leadership development program? Were you encouraged at your organization to take on more leadership? We'd love to hear from you about that. If you could share that with us in the chat box. Great. So we have a few responses coming in. Observing role model leaders, mentoring and networking. Coaching has also shown up. A year-long statewide leadership development program. A crisis. Okay, that's we actually didn't have that on the list of options, so thanks for sharing that. That also can open up the door unexpectedly to leadership opportunities. Great, thanks so much for responding. The chat's going really quick, so I'm trying to read what I see, and I encourage everyone to take a look at your chat box and see what people are sharing. Encouragement and empowerment with stretch projects, that's really, I think, an important example, and shows that organizations are looking at their staff team and really wanting to build their bench strength. So that's really exciting. Connections, that's another important step in terms of growing and ascending in your leadership. Awesome. Okay, so another response: more interface and work with the board. Yeah, that's really critical in terms of growing your knowledge and expertise as a leader, is connecting with the board and working closely with them. Great networking, mentorship, also a few more responses along that line. Great. Well, thank you guys for responding to that poll, and I encourage people to just keep looking at the responses as we turn now to our guest presenter, Dr. Sonja Mañjon.
Thanks, Yolanda, and welcome, Sonia. So just get started. Why don't you tell us briefly about LeaderSpring?
Hi. Yeah, thank you, Rusty and Yolanda, for asking me to do this webinar with you. Being a researcher myself, I get excited when I see studies that come out that actually confirm what we all know in the field. So thank you for doing this. LeaderSpring Center is a 22-year-old intermediary organization that has participated in leadership development all along, with a 2-year fellowship program that was initially set up for executive directors, and executive directors sort of in their mid-career level. I myself am an alumna of LeaderSpring, so I was in the program 2005, 2006, as was our deputy director, Sophie Giroux, is also an alumna of the program, class of 2008. So I've been the executive director for the last 2 years, following a 17-year executive director. And so a lot of what we are talking about in this report is very familiar to me. What we're looking at moving forward with LeaderSpring is really adding a racial equity lens to the work that we do, both in the fellowship program and our impact consulting work, which is a relatively new component of LeaderSpring. So one thing that I focused on when I took over the leadership was really looking at our history of serving executive directors, and we have probably over 550 executive directors that have gone through the program. And again, being a researcher and looking at the numbers and the demographics, what I noticed was that women of color were the least served. And we really wanted to focus on women of color in the sector, and also in technology, which I'll talk about in a moment. So, a lot of research has come out about where women of color, what our numbers are, and some of them are on the screen here. Some numbers from the American Association of the University of Women, which I'm most familiar with. I just left academia after an 18-year stint as both a associate professor and administrator at 3 different universities. And so, looking at the similarities of what happens in higher ed and in nonprofit, and now that we're launching research and technology, seeing those similarities, that women of color really are at the bottom of the totem pole when it comes to ascension into leadership. And so we really wanted to focus our efforts in that demographic. So just a little bit about our current fellowship, which is Women of Color Lead Strong. In this particular fellowship, we decided that we were not going to limit it to just executive directors of nonprofits, but we wanted to look at women in the sector that were emerging leaders that wanted to be in executive director positions or were in positions where they were able to make policy or financial decisions impacting the organization. And so we came up with Women of Color Lead Strong, and we really wanted to focus what we're doing on efforts to oppose systems of oppression. We really wanted to focus on 4 segments in this particular leadership program, and one being the work-life balance that promotes wellness, which you talked about in your slide on, needs versus investment, that we saw a lot of burnout for this demographic, particularly for women that were emerging into leadership positions and for women that were in leadership positions. And so we really want to focus a lot of what we're doing on personal development in terms of live-work balance. And this particular cohort just started in January, so it's a new cohort. We have 18 women that are participating. They're actually meeting today as we speak, and it's a fabulous group of women throughout the Bay Area, San Francisco, Oakland, Richmond, San Leandro, Contra Costa County. So it's a very diverse group of women and a diverse group of organizations that are participating.
Well, I was, I was just, wanting to hear your thoughts on sort of digging into the fellowship, whether it's the one that's been ongoing, or this new iteration with women of color in particular. Both sort of, what do you see in terms of the sort of challenges around Ascension? I mean, you referred to a couple now, but in terms of how people think about or the support they're looking for career advancement and Ascension.
Yeah, so one thing that we're doing, and thank you for asking that question, because that's a great lead into this next project that we're working on. And this is a research project. Myself being an academic and being a researcher, I wanted to, begin to look at, what are some areas that we can really hold up as being able to support women of color in their journey in leadership and through leadership. And so we launched this program called a Roadmap to Culture Change and Technology that advances and promotes women of color. And when we were looking at, again, the numbers of women of color, it was very, very dismal. And further dissecting the numbers in terms of, we wanted to focus on, African American women of African descent and Latinx women, but we also found out that there was a significant number of Asian women in technology, but they weren't advancing. And so even though the numbers were larger, there was an issue with Ascension for that group as well. Focus groups in 4 states: San Francisco, California, Columbus, Ohio, Boston, Massachusetts, and New York, to bring together women to really focus on 4 key issues. So the 4 areas that we're focusing this roadmap on have to do with agency, how women of color see their power in the workplace, in the environment. The second one being mentorship versus sponsorships. and we're trying to delineate the difference between the two. The third area is feedback and communication. You know, what the level of feedback and communication are for women of color in the sector. Managing bias, you know, which is huge in all of our sectors, but how women are managing bias. And so from those 4 subgroups, we're developing both a roadmap for organizations to pilot anywhere from a year to 2 years, and also developing a scorecard by which they can track change over time.
And do you imagine that these 4 areas and this research in tech will translate pretty closely with experiences in nonprofit?
I think so. I mean, I've been looking at, there's a lot of research coming out right now for women of color and nonprofit. You know, the research that you've done, the research that the Movement Project is doing. And I'm really familiar with the research in academia because that's where I've been for the last 18 years. And so when I begin to compare the research, there's a lot of similarities. How
do you see LeaderSpring currently, or how do you want to see it in the future, supporting intersectional racial equity in Ascension, like with the folks who are not EDs but may want to be, and then with the folks who are EDs, and you know, women of color and others?
Yeah, there's 2 ways that we're looking at the work that we're doing in terms of how do we support. Yolanda mentioned that she was introducing me. My background is in systems change work, and so I take a critical lens when I'm looking at the systems in which we're working in, whether it's a nonprofit system or being referred to as the nonprofit industrial complex, higher ed, technology. And, when we really begin to dissect these systems, we see that they have all been developed from a very colonial, hierarchical, and patriarchal constructs. And those constructs are not developed to support, women of color, LGBT, just anyone that falls outside of those parameters. And so when you look at issues of advancement, then you begin to see there's a direct correlation with structures and systems and, what's happening or what's not happening in the field. So while we're looking at our impact consulting and specifically targeting systems change work, how do we begin to promote different ways of being within our organizations? And that the other side of that is also promoting leadership development, for those of us that are in positions or that are wanting to be in positions. And so we're kind of taking a 2-pronged approach to the work that we do. Many of my conversations have with organizations and technology specifically have been around, we send our women of color out to be trained. And, my response to that is, if they're already in the organization, that means that they have a level of expertise. And it's not always sending us as, i.e., women of color out to get more training. But at a point, we need to begin to look at the systems in which we're working in and begin to ask the questions of, why certain things are or are not happening. So we're working on both ends, both at the individual level with our fellowship programs and in systems change work.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense and often gets left out. And the onus is on the individual, needs to be better somehow or filled up with more information or skills. I think that's one of the things that Building Movement Project has really
right.
emphasized in their research is that, the problem is not with people of color lacking something, but rather that there are these systemic barriers and challenges that they face.
Exactly.
Trying to.
Exactly.
I'm curious to move from the organizational level that we've been talking about with LeaderSpring to your own experience, if you're willing to share, or
Sure.
your own observations of folks what you've seen in the field. How are you seeing, what are you experiencing or seeing in terms of these executive transitions and ascensions to leadership, and what does it mean to take over for a 17-year predecessor? And
yeah, yeah, no, it's very challenging. It's you mentioned the wait and see approach that funders have, and making the decision to come back to the Bay Area and become the second executive director of LeaderSpring. I was very excited about that. I'm an alum of the program. It has really helped me on my leadership journey. What I learned in my fellowship program, the connections that I have made have been invaluable, not only for the folks that were in my cohort, but for individuals that I meet that are in other cohorts as well. So I was very excited about coming back to the Bay Area. And, what I did find, though, is, transferring relationships is a very, very hard thing to do. And so, your outcome, that has the wait and see approach from funders, I think is very real. The previous executive director, did an amazing job at introducing me to a lot of her contacts, people that she had worked with over the years, specifically funders. And what I have come to understand in the now 2 years, it'll be 2 years next month that I've been at the helm, is that those relationships don't transfer. The introductions are there, but it's a lot of work, really developing a relationship with the funder. And I think one thing that I've been very conscious about in these last 2 years is how do I establish relationships with the organization and not just with me as the executive director. And so have been, really conscious about introducing, the deputy director, having her, go to meetings, having other people within the organization, attend different types of events so that there's a familiarity with the organization, and not just with me. And so I think that's, one thing that I'm trying to focus on.
There's no easy transfer. It's not like some kind of financial exchange, although that's part of it, right? It really is about relationships and. Exactly.
Yeah, and I think that also ties really nicely into, my reflections on the report that's done. I mean, the research shows what we know. The same with, the Building Movement Project, the research that they're doing, it shows what we know. Every time I hear the results of these reports, it's like, yep, it's dead spot on. So, for me, your recommendations, are spot on. Structural change is necessary, and really challenging the white dominant cultural norms. I mean, that's the work that we're doing in terms of systems change. We really want people to critically examine, policies and norms and culture that exists, within the organization, building balance and healthy, work-life environment. One thing that I do at LeaderSpring is, we all now work virtually, and we have a co-working space downtown Oakland when we need to be in an office environment, but we also have Fridays off as self-care days. So every Friday, it's about, how are we taking care of ourselves? And then succession planning and sabbaticals, are important. Next month, I'm going to take the month off. I need to recharge my battery. And a lot of EDs don't do that. In your second year, it's like when you're just figuring out the lay of the land and the roadmap. And so, that's kind of not promoted as a time to take time off, but, we need to recharge. And I'm constantly thinking about, who are, the women or the individuals that are coming behind me that want to be in leadership positions, and how do I, mentor them, and how do I, help them, come up to speed in what area they're interested in. And then just valuing diverse leadership styles. It's not a one size fits all. We all bring a lot to the table in terms of who we are and how we do the work, and that really, really needs to be valued. So, as I was reading your report, I was just shaking my head. Yes, yes, yes.
Well, it's the report, and there's recommendations in there, and then there's the toolkit, which, tries to bring them down to a practical level. So I think you've hit on some of each of those. So let's turn here as we head towards Q&A. Are there specific things you think that funders, or nonprofits should be thinking about to invest in equity at this Ascension transition stage?
Well, I mean, this is something that I think we all know. I mean, the population trends, as we are becoming, more non-white in terms of the majority of individuals, when we look at funders' investment in our organizations, it's not on par. It's not on par with the demographics, within the United States. And so one thing I think funders need to realize is, where is the equity in funding? Where is the equity in investment for organizations that are led by people of color, particularly Black and brown skinned individuals? Where is the equity for organizations that are serving communities of color, that are serving low income communities? While we're looking at equity, I think that, the whole foundation complex needs to be looking at, what does equity mean? And there are some foundations that are doing an amazing job. You mentioned Borealis, philanthropy, Akanati. I mean, there's a lot of foundations, Wine Soda, that really are taking the equity issue, looking at it critically. But I think we need to start looking at, equity in terms of population served in the United States. I see there's a question here from Ken Saxton. We're working on hiring our full-time ED right now. What recommendations do you have for us to create a hiring and onboarding process that's more equitable? Ken, I would say first, you need to do like an equity scan of your organization. I don't know how old your organization is, but, for you to be hiring your first full-time ED, really look at, what structure are you bringing this person into? What are the policies? What are some of the biases that are not talked about? Really taking the time to understand the culture that your organization is in, because first, I mean, I've been the first in a lot of organizations from higher ed to nonprofit that were not ready for first. And so whether it's the first full-time ED, whether it's the first person of color in that position, whether it's the first woman, and so the organization really needs to do its own organizational scan to understand how to do that. And that's something that we do too. We look at executive leadership transitions, and so I'd be willing to give you some information offline about that.
We do have another question there from Howard. What are key barriers to ascension for leaders of color, and what has worked to overcome these barriers? We tried to cover some of that in the data, but you know, and I think, Sonia, you've addressed some, but is there anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, you know, I think another, just the key barrier is that, you know, how do you manage bias? That's a huge one. You know, that's one of the areas that we're looking into in our research for women of color in technology is, you know, biases are unconscious and they're unintended, but they're there, you know, they exist. And, you know, again, when you're looking to do an organizational scan, you know, that's something that can also be done. That's something that we're actually doing with organizations that are wanting to do this work before we start. You know, we do organizational scans in terms of what are some of the key areas that you're particularly interested in focusing on within your organization. But overcoming those barriers is a systemic problem. You know, I mean, we can overcome the barriers by kind of fortifying ourselves and understanding the water that we're swimming in. And, you know, one of two things happen for leaders of color. You know, we either assimilate into that culture, which is also, you know, damaging for our spirits and our souls, or we leave. And so I think, you know, for organizations, you know, really taking a hard look at their systems and their structures, and asking themselves, you know, what are we doing or what are we not doing for leaders of color to ascend in the organization or in the industry that they're in.
So, Sonia, thanks for tackling those questions in the chat box. I actually have another question related to LeaderSpring's work. So you've mentioned that you recently partnered with TSNE MissionWorks based up in Boston, formerly Third Sector New England, to bring to the West Coast a program called What's Next? Leading a Thriving Transition. So can you share a little bit more with us about that program and why you think it's needed?
Sure. So What's Next is it's a cohort of executive directors that are transitioning out, and pretty much long-term executive directors. And with a long-term executive director that transitions out, which, you know, I found out as I was taking over the leadership of LeaderSpring, is that, you know, the organization really becomes that leader. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be, thoughtful work that needs to be done about how this transition is going to happen. Another thing that I've seen, you know, through different studies is that the executive director that follows a long-term ED usually only lasts 2 years. And so I see myself like really needing a break after 2 years because it's a hard work, you know, trying to understand what that culture has been, and sometimes shift for the better, shift to new ideas. And so this program was really developed by TSNE MissionWorks to have a thoughtful approach about how to transition long-term leadership. The next cohort, we're actually recruiting right now for the next cohort, and it's October 6th through 8th and December 8th through 10th. There are 2 sessions that will be held at the Chaminade Resort in Santa Cruz, and so it's a beautiful place to look at that. But also what we found from the Building Movement Project, Race to Lead, is that, you know, people of color want to be in these positions, you know, more so than white folks. And it's about an uneven playing field and the frustrations of representation. It's not personal, it's system, it's systemic, it's the structure. So we look at all of that, and we're also from a racial equity lens, and how does the organization then prepare itself to onboard a new executive director.
Great, thanks for walking us through that that program. And I had heard about this program several years back, so I'm really excited to see that it will expand in partnership with LeaderSpring in the fall.
What I did want to comment on what's next and move us into wrap up. I think for me, I also, when I was executive director and founder of Emerging Practitioners in Philanthropy, for me, I went to a 2-day confidential workshop for EDs who were thinking about leaving, and it was put on by a group at that time called Transition Guide, which itself I think has pretty much closed up shop. But it was critical to have that space and then get some coaching, and there are books that they produced that were really helpful and template for some things. So it really helped to feel like I was not alone and I didn't have to make it up. And I think for me, a key underlying thing from this whole conversation is about respect. Respecting the work that we all do, everyone on this webinar in the sector, and that it is work, and it's hard work, and we have to respect outgoing folks and the challenges they face, and incoming executives and the challenges they face. And if we can respect our people of all types, then we can create these spaces for people to be able to lead as a form of leadership and also step up into leadership. And both things are so critical. And the role of funding and funders and fundraising is just an essential building block to all of that. So that's just my own kind of reflection. And so I'm so also thrilled that you're doing the What's Next work, as well as the other fellowship with women of color and everything, because it's just so essential at every stage to be supporting people in these journeys. So thanks Sonia for taking the time to share your work with us, and thanks to everybody for being on the webinar. I know we want to share a few resources that are upcoming. As I mentioned earlier, talentjustice.org has our full report, an executive summary, some great infographics. There's also a toolkit with 10 individual tools that help translate the recommendations and findings from our report into action. So I commend those to you. And talentjustice.org is part of the broader Fund the People toolkit with other resources about talent investing more generally. I know there's some resources from LeaderSpring.
We're launching our first equity series this fall with these 3 programs, advancing equity and design thinking. There's a lot of design thinking, that's being done in organizations, and we're really critically looking at, the lens and the lack of equity in that lens. Passing the torch, we don't have a date for it yet, but our website is leaderspring.org. It's passing the torch, bridging the intergenerational divide. We have heard from, our younger sisters that are emerging into leadership positions, and, they're not wanting to recreate the wheel, and they're really looking at, how do we effectively, pass the leadership torch. And then we're ending the series with a board summit centering racial equity, because a lot of this work really has to be done at the board level. And that's November 6th. Unfortunately, these are all in Oakland, California. So for those of you that are national, we're thinking about how to bring some of these workshops to the East Coast and to the Midwest with some of our partners that we're working with in those locations.
That's great. We look forward to you coming east. Okay, yeah. So Fund the People will be on the road this fall. In August, a member of our research partners team, the Center for Urban and Racial Equity, will be presenting on our behalf on this research at the Michigan Nonprofit Association in Detroit at their Talent Strategy Summit. October 4th will be in San Diego. Michelle Jaramillo is on this webinar as a participant. Thanks, Michelle, for hosting us. That's a tentative date, but we're 90% there, so I decided to include it. October 22, we'll be in Chicago presenting alongside with the folks from the Capacity Building Initiative at the Ford Foundation, to funders and hopefully nonprofits as well at Forefront. And then in November, we're looking at doing a webinar for funders with Philanthropy West Virginia. So just wanted to share those with any of you who are in those regions or just want to keep tabs on what we're doing. I know another thing we wanted to make sure we've mentioned a couple times, Build a Movement Project on this webinar and their Race to Lead study. They did a big survey a couple of years ago and they're re-surveying this summer. So if you want to participate in their survey, you can go to racetolead.org. And again, that's race2lead.org. This is our email addresses for those of you who want to be in touch with any of us. Feel free to reach out or follow. You can follow Fund the People on social media. We're most active on Twitter. Sonia, I don't know if you guys have any social media you want to share with folks?
We do. Yeah, we're also on Twitter, LeaderSpring, at LeaderSpring, and Facebook at LeaderSpring Center. So you can find us. Yeah.
Just search wherever you get your social media for LeaderSpring or Fund the People. And I know, I don't know, Yolanda, if you want to close us out here.
Yeah, I want to, sure. Just want to thank Sonia for joining us today and presenting on this really important topic and sharing the great work that LeaderSpring is doing and the work that's coming up, the work that you're doing to help with executive directors transitioning out of their roles. And also, we appreciate you sharing your personal experience with us and also your journey as a executive director of an organization that had a long-term founding executive director in place. So we really appreciate that. I think it helps to put this data into context and makes it real for us. So
thank you.
Yeah, and thank you, Rusty, for sharing the research findings. And thank you all for joining us today. As I mentioned at the beginning, we will share this recording and the PowerPoint slides with you in the next few days. And please check us out at Fund the People, and also make sure to download our report and also our toolkit at talentjustice.org. And wishing everybody a great day. Thank you.